Appamada's programs and facilities are supported through your generosity. Your support really does make a huge difference. You'll find a link for contributions on the website at appamada.org/contribute. Thank you so much.
Thank you, friends, for joining today's sitting. Thank you, Kim, for being today's doshi, and John for ringing the bells. Rosemary, thank you for being our monitor. Eileen, how delightful to see you. It's been a long time. Kathy, I'm so glad you're here. And Lisa, I'm so glad you're here. I'm going to talk about Flint's Dharma talk of August 28th, along with what I see as some of what I see as the most important context behind it, and about what that talk and that context mean to me and what they can mean for Appamada. And my goal is to amplify some of Flint's points so that it will help us in building the future of our Sangha. I'm going to give away my big idea, my punchline right now. And I hope that you'll come with me on the journey through this talk to see how I got to it. This is a very personal view, and I extend deepest gratitude to Peg and Flint. And I should say, I need to apologize at the beginning if I am distorting what they are teaching. I sincerely don't think so, but there is a possibility. Flint will be joining us later today for the final sitting of the afternoon and for our closing discussion. So he'll have a chance to clarify where I go astray if that's necessary. And I also realize that what I'm going to present as a big revelation to me may be something that's blindingly obvious to other people. And I apologize if so. I hope you'll stick with me. Okay, so here it is. As of today, my understanding that from the period that began sometime in 2019 and extends up through Flint's talk of August 28th, it is this. Peg and Flint have set Appamada on a radical path. I mean that in the best possible way. Peg and Flint have reframed the task of our Sangha from self-directed awakening to something much more specific, which is building this particular practice community to embrace everyone who is here, everyone who connects with Appamada's teachings on the cloud, and all the sister sanghas and sitting groups in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Arkansas, the UK, and elsewhere. All of those among us who hunger for Zen as religion, with steeped in formality and tradition, and all of us who hunger for what has been called modern Zen or secular Buddhism or Protestant Zen. All of us who are full of energy, all of us who have been stamped by grief or illness, or who see their strengths fading away, or who see the inevitability of death as more than a distant idea. All of us who can acknowledge the bottomless mystery that is our life in this universe, and can meet that mystery with gratitude and compassion. Gratitude and compassion and the other qualities that Peg and Flint have taught and embodied in their lives. So why do I say this is radical? And it is because the path that Peg and Flint are pointing us toward, depending on your point of view, have depending on your point of view, either have gently pointed us toward or traumatically pitched us into. This path is by definition one that all of us have to construct out of a bewildering array of materials. I heard a joke one time where a comedian was saying that marriage was like a game of chess played on a chessboard made of water with chess pieces made of mist. And that image occurs to me right now in what we are facing in our future. We have a bewildering array of materials, including our own very limited lives, and the outcome is far from certain. We could fail. And many Sangha members are concerned that we might already be failing. And we can't absolutely be certain either, right now, what success would look like. Why would Peg and Flint do this? I think it's because they understand that the Bodhisattva vow needs to come out of the mists of medieval China and become practical in this life, and that the task of building our Sangha is the best, most practical, most effective way of doing that. I recently started reading a book published in 2021 called The Garden of Flowers and Weeds, a new translation and commentary on the Blue Cliff Record by Matthew Juksan Sullivan. He describes himself as a student of the Korean Sun teacher Yangyil Sunim. So far, I'm finding it to be a delightful, exceptionally accessible book. After describing Yangyil Sunim's style, which he says is engineered to compel you to figure out things for yourself, he turns to, and before he turns to the koans in the Blue Cliff Record, Sullivan gives a brief history of Buddhism and Zen, which includes the following. Shakyamuni taught that anyone can become spiritually awakened if they followed a regime of meditation and morality. He framed this path as a release from suffering. Our false views and selfish desires keep us trapped in samsara, the wandering, which is the endless cycle of birth, hardship, sickness, death, and rebirth. Insight into the true nature of things ends this suffering and is called nirvana, the quenching. Once a person attains nirvana, they live out their life in peace and are free thereafter from the trouble of reincarnation once they die. And he adds an aside, it is a testimony to how difficult life was in Iron Age India that the most ambitious outcome a visionary like Shakyamuni could imagine was freedom from being reborn. I would imagine that our present-day analog would be something a lot more psychological and even more self-centered. Not everyone would agree with Sullivan's last quoted statement. Stephen Batchelor cites the Buddha's parable about coming upon an ancient ruined city in the jungle and argues that the Buddha's intention was more about building a just and enlightened society than about focusing on individual enlightenment. Separately, of course, there is the whole history of Mahayana Buddhism, our tradition, which insists that the Buddha's teaching, seen in the proper light, leads to engagement with the liberation of all beings, just as naturally as in the parable about Dawu and Yunyan, reaching your hand back to the cool side of the pillow in the night. Be that as it may, there is a lot in the original Buddha's teachings that some sincere practitioners see as focused on transcending this human predicament. And certainly it is commonsensical, or it seems commonsensical to me, that as practitioners, we tend to come to meditation and the Dharma with a project in mind that involves relieving our own suffering. And that, given the way our brains and our minds and our bodies work, the mind's focus on the self-centered dream remains utterly relentless, and it seeps into our practice again and again. I found this to be true particularly, have found this to be true particularly when we think we're beyond being all self-centered, and particularly when we disagree with someone about how things should be going in our Sangha, and they resolutely refuse to accept how right we are. I bow to our teachers, Peg and Flint, who are close by to help us see through lots of delusions, like the one that says we can go beyond our human nature once and for all in an instant. And instead, that we have to face up to that human nature pretty much every goddamn moment. I think that's what Flint was doing in his August 28th talk. In that talk, Flint's words were from the start highly positive. He said it was intended as encouragement, a pep talk, although he didn't use that word, a reorientation for longtime practitioners. But listening in online in Albuquerque here, I couldn't help but notice that his voice and his demeanor were a little shaky at the beginning. I hope everyone has already seen or heard that talk. I'm going to give an outline of what he covered because I want to, again, amplify some of the points and to focus on some of the things that I think really need further amplification. And even though I'm going to be doing violence to a very subtle and beautifully constructed talk by truncating it, even this outline is pretty long. So again, please bear with me. Flint begins with gratitude to those listening and to Peg, and then, interestingly, to Cassie Wyant, whose photograph he says he should have acknowledged in his invitation to the talk. Here is Flint showing, as he often does, that even in a somewhat charged moment, it's important to enact repair and reconciliation when one knows that a mistake has been made. So he begins with that embodiment. He says, "You might notice that me giving a Sunday talk is unusual. And you might read between the lines, sensing that something is up." He says he knows that people have been sharing their struggles with him. So he's hinting at something troubling. And he announces the theme of his talk. "I love this community, and I want to remind you to offer yourselves as best you can to this community if you love it too." He says he hopes to offer a little inspiration. He says he will reflect on three threads. First, the thread of foundations, including the chant that pays homage to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that represent archetypal energies, and the chant that dedicates the merit of our practice to people who have embodied these energies, some of whom he has been very close to. He says we need to remember how the life-altering gift of our practice comes to us, and that we should remember that we are actively joining all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas every time we sit together. And he emphasizes together. Plus, we should be actively aware, he says, that our sitting is an embodied ceremonial practice, conveyed through forms which then form us in profound and often unseen ways. Flint spoke of engaging these forms with vitality and devotion to unite the sublime and the mundane, leaving nothing out. Next, he talked about the thread of constancy. He introduced this section on a kind of foreboding note, quoting the line, "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold," from the poem by William Butler Yeats, The Second Coming. He said, "I have heard from many of you, some version of a shared concern. Will the center, appamada, survive, thrive, flourish?" He asked, "What if your practice begins to turn into a new place of suffering?" And he makes a rueful joke. "I take refuge in Sangha, bringing harmony to everyone, free from hindrance," from our chant that we just said. And he adds, "Ha." He reflects on stressors that have affected appamada, leading to these questions, including the COVID pandemic and uncertainty about its aftermath, and the fact that the founding teachers have stepped back. He says the current entrusted teachers can't do everything on their own, and they can't be himself or Peg. Then Flint turned, surprisingly to me, to the theme of trauma. He says everyone experiences difficulties in life, but why do such experiences become trauma for some and not for others? It's not because of severity, he says. He says, difficulties become trauma, one, if you can't talk about it, and two, if you can't use your body to move and respond to it. And I will come back to this point later. Flint says there are evolutionary events for all sanghas, from troubling losses to surprise gifts that create shockwaves and that also create new possibilities. He says we should not be surprised that they are occurring at Appamada and that they will occur in the future. He quoted the ancient Indian saying, often cited by Suzuki Roshi, when you fall to the ground, use the ground to get back up again. Appreciate the ground of practice and use it to get back up. Reach out to help others and offer yourself in service to the community, he says. He asked, where is the source of energy in the Sangha now? And how do we fan the embers to encourage the flame of practice? Are we embodying constancy? He talked about Suzuki Roshi's use of the term constancy instead of patience, because patience, as Suzuki said, can imply that you're being forced to do something kind of through gritted teeth, while constancy arises out of a sense of emptiness, as it's understood in Zen. That is, the emptiness that is the interconnectedness, the complete and inescapable interconnectedness of everything. Constancy implies offering yourself to the next thing. And he says, notice I didn't say do the next thing, offering yourself to the next thing. Flint quoted Angeles Arien's fourfold way, which is show up, pay attention, tell the truth, and don't be attached to the outcome. Doing all these things in the spirit of constancy, he said, includes showing up for practice and each other, paying attention to what is moving in self and the community, unfolding the truth of each moment, including confusions and difficulties, and, in a Zen paradox, both practicing as if your hair is on fire and holding it all very lightly. This leads to his discussion of the third thread, Zen practice, which calls up both great faith and great doubt. We will listen to this section, which again is very beautiful, from the talk later this afternoon as a prompt for a writing activity. For now, I'll just quote a couple of points he makes. In tone, a lot of what he shares is a little abstract, but then he dives back in, saying the practice path will break our hearts and will give us the resources to meet heartbreak with resilience. This is what happens on the path of practice, and it is where we find ourselves now. Then he concludes, please honor where we have come from these past 10 or 15 years. Pay homage by showing up and encouraging others. Dedicate your practice to each other, touching and inspiring others, and recognizing that we are always making a difference to each other, whether we know it or not. Walk, chant, bow, and engage in all the forms with energy. Be upright and dignified. Other bodies will resonate like tuning forks. Offer what you want to happen. Don't wait for it to come to you. As I said earlier, I apologize for truncating a subtle and elegantly constructed presentation. But I know that everyone has access to the original, and the reason I summarized it is that now I want to draw attention to a couple of what I see, or to one answered, really it's just one, unanswered question, and a provocative and unfollowed thread. And I wanted the context to be a little fresh for that. So, again, my theme. Again, this is my personal view, and I know that it is one that you may not share. Peg and Flint have set us on a radical path, one that requires that we turn away from seeking enlightenment for ourselves, no surprise, and not quite that we practice for all beings. Instead, that we focus on our Sangha as the most practical way to make the Bodhisattva vow real. It requires that we fully turn in commitment to each other and that we construct our Sangha following the lines of the city that they've laid out in the jungle that we're stumbling upon, so that we can be a light unto ourselves and to the world. It requires that we take heed of the qualities and modes of action that Flint enumerated in his talk, and that we practice this Sangha building as if the outcomes did not matter and as if they were truly crucial for ourselves and for the world. Speaking for myself, I'll say I'm in awe of what Flint accomplished in this talk. It truly was a reorientation for me. Flint's charisma, warmth, and insight first brought me to Appamada, and then the amazing glow of Peg's constancy, energy, and generosity has kept me coming back for nearly 15 years. There is so much good that is happening at Appamada, all of it made possible by generous offerings of time and effort from Sangha members. I want to list some, and I know I'm going to make the egregious mistake of leaving somebody out, and I apologize for that in the beginning. But I want to list some of the people who are keeping things going. There's the care and skill of Appamada's board in maintaining fiscal stability and planning for the future. Kathy is a member of that board, and there are several new members who have stepped forward in the last few months to take on this often unrewarding and often unrecognized role. I want to thank Todd for his talks and for shepherding the Precepts program for more than 2 years. I want to thank Lori for her steady leadership and presence and the heart-filled, body-filled way she has of offering teachings. Kim for a mind-boggling list of things, but first of all for keeping the robust electronic connections open for all of us. Rosemary and Jessica and Maria and Nancy for acting as online monitors, welcoming people from the Cloud Sangha. And I want to thank the wonderful Cloud Sangha members like Becky and Sarah who come day after day. I want to thank Laurie and Lipscomb, Christoph, Stephanie, John Cooley, Susan Kadurka, and others who are coming every day to join the Sangha and to fill roles and offering steady, loving presence. I want to thank John Eric for keeping the calendar up to date, and Jessica for handling registrations, and all the people who have done those, again, unrecognized tasks in the past that are so important for helping us stay together and maintain cohesiveness. None of this could have happened and would be happening if Peg and Flint, and really primarily Peg, had not methodically created the structures to make it possible. Peg had seen what happened in groups that depended solely on the efforts of a single teacher, and had seen how that way of organizing a Sangha maintained Sangha members in a kind of perpetual immaturity. I'm bad with dates, so I can't remember just when it was that Peg and Flint started explicitly talking about Appamada's future as a lay-led Sangha and creating a structure to make it work. To them, even though they were both ordained and would later go on to be to have Dharma transmission, their vision for Appamada was that it be lay-led by people like me and you. Perhaps it was 8 years ago, something like that, maybe 10. I was alarmed when Peg first asked me to join Council 1. I was afraid that it meant she was sick or was leaving for some other reason. And I was very happy to see that she was, in fact, planning for what seemed like a very distant future. I loved the training in the right use of power that we had at the beginning. And then with other council members, I chafed when our meetings shifted to calendar planning and role filling, leaving the explicit learning opportunities behind. But I was always nourished by the chance to share and support the practice path that we shared. Over time, 4 councils were formed, and they contributed to a wonderful communal experience for Appamada that has paid off, just in the way that Peg and Flint envisioned, I think. But there's trauma in the Sangha, which I think is real and which comes from the situation that Flint described. We have not been able to talk together in an effective way about difficult events, and we have not been able to move expressively in response to those events. We see it today. It used to be that for a Saturday sitting, there would be perhaps 10, even as many as 20 people who came together in the Zendo. And while there would have been only a few online, it was probably more than this a year ago or 2 years ago. I'd say that first of all, that part of the factors contributing to the trauma, is that we're simply a big group. There's a core of steady practitioners and a huge array of people who connect when they can, or who drop in once or twice to see what Appamada is about. It is a fact that more than half of the people who connect with Appamada each week do so only to see Flint's inquiry. That's not a bad thing, but it is different from what Flint is describing in his talk, and different from what is needed for the task for the future. So I think this diffuseness is a factor in Appamada's ongoing trauma. Flint talked about the pandemic, which made it impossible for us to be together. For a year, at least, once a week, I was in the Zendo to lead sittings and services on my own, and other people shared this experience, with only the TV glow. And then later, the chance to talk with people in several states and even several continents, which was very nourishing. So there were some nourishing things and some difficult things about that experience. Then things changed with the pandemic, and we were able to open up to a few people and then more people. And then suddenly, last summer, we had to shut down again. Meanwhile, of course, over the course of several years, hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens were dying from the pandemic, millions worldwide. And the response to the pandemic had been deliberately, and I think maliciously, made into a political snarl, pitting us against each other. And there was no venue for processing the grief that a lot of people felt in the Sangha and the society at large. During the brief period when we could gather, we had a couple of outdoor gatherings, one of which was designed to be an expression of this grief. About 10 people showed up. Peg and Flint, this is another point that I think is traumatic for the Sangha. Peg and Flint chose 3 people to be entrusted teachers, all of us with strengths and limitations. And I think that the move toward becoming a lay Lord Sangha, while it picked up momentum at that point, I don't think there had been enough preparation for this change and enough chance to align with this vision. I know from personal conversations around that time that some Sangha members were not comfortable with that sort of a shift, and really that in their minds, the only possible replacements for Peg or Flint that they wanted to see in the future would be someone of similar stature and demonstrated commitment, not to mention charisma. In fact, I was one of those people. That is until I was called upon to stop clinging to my preferences and to step up, and to offer my full support to Todd and Laurie, and my full trust in my teachers, which remains a challenge for me today. Nevertheless, I think there is unresolved trauma over this change in Appamada. Flint moved to Hawaii, and there was no shortage of expressions of concern and loss around that time, or at least that was my experience. Plenty of people felt empowered to speak and to let him know what we were feeling. He has been a steady presence with us through inquiry and other offerings, but nevertheless, as a community, there's still a need for us to process what his moving away to Hawaii meant. Peg moved to Chicago. I still have a photograph on my phone of her parking place out behind the little house behind Apamata. I had been leading a sitting that morning, and I came out to the back house to in hopes that I could say goodbye to her, because I knew she was planning to leave that day when the movers showed up. And I missed her. So I took a picture of the empty parking spot. It still makes me sad to see it. I'm happy for Peg's change. I know it has unleashed several of her characteristic bursts of creativity, and creativity that will be of great benefit to our Sangha and to the broader Zen community in the world in the future. But there was not really a process, a way to process the upheaval that this produced in the Sangha. And I have felt it very strongly. Peg has organized weekly meetings of the entrusted teachers with Flint and including Suzanne in Madison and Josh in England, with Flint and herself. But I have confessed that I have not used those meetings well. Now I recognize that I am still carrying some trauma from being unable to speak about a particular aspect of the change, which was how suddenly Todd, Laurie, and I changed from being people who got to give talks every once in a while and to offer practice discussion, and all of a sudden we were people who needed to help others negotiate difficult emotions and conflicts within this Sangha that were threatening to the Sangha and threatened to, in some cases, threatened to cause people to break off their practice. That was a lot to shoulder, and I don't feel like I was prepared enough for it, and it's still something I'm working on. Like I say, I haven't, although Peg has set up the opportunity to talk about this in these meetings, I've largely kept it to myself. And it's really only in preparing for this talk that I have been able to formulate it for myself. Finally, I'm getting to the end here, and thank you for bearing with me. Finally, the councils, as I said before, have been the springboard for amazing cohesion and success in our community. But stresses are affecting them. I meet regularly with Council 3, and in the past year or two, 2 of the group's 6 members have left, and 2 more are currently questioning why the group even meets and whether they should continue. Similar things are happening in other councils. There are stresses in people's lives that pull them away. And then there are the internal dynamics of these groups, which turn from positive to negative on a dime. You can't step into the same river twice, but I hope that the trauma affecting the councils can find a voice and a movement to a new, more effective way of being and serving this community. Meeting with Flint on Zoom this week in preparation for this talk, I was heartened that he reiterated what he'd said on August 28th. What turns difficulty into trauma is the feeling of being stuck and voiceless. And that he welcomed my intention for us today to get more people talking, some about where we are as a Sangha. I have given a couple of examples about myself, which truthfully are all workable. But I am sadly confident that there are dozens more examples of difficulties and even trauma in the Zendo and among the people connected online or who will hear this talk in the future. So let us talk and move later as we can, again and again in the future as we need to, so that we can actually free ourselves up to act in a mature, upright, dignified way and embody what Peg and Flint have offered us and what Flint has pointed to in his talk. I was going to give a quote from the Heart Sutra here, but I think this is the place to stop. So please ask me any questions you can or that you want, and let me try and answer them. Hi, Lisa. Thank you.
Um, this is a question born of ignorance. As you were talking, I was thinking of the Austin Zen Center and the fact that they have a more resident priest, is it? Or again, I'm a neophyte in all of this. Has that been raised as a possibility for having someone else of Peg or Flint's stature more in resident? Well, I guess that doesn't make any sense. I'm thinking of in the Austin community, and that's being sort of narrow rather.
No, Lisa, it makes perfect sense. Your
Oh,
question makes perfect sense. And it is among the questions that people have asked as a possibility for the future. But it's my understanding that that's not in line with what Peg and Flint have wanted. Uh, but I think that that is an ongoing question. I just, that is, what they have wanted is what they have wanted. And that's something we need to talk out. So. But again, I think it's important that there be preparation and that there be a chance for alignment or creative disagreement, and not just this is the way it's got to be. Shut up and sit down and shut up.
yeah.
That's not turning out to be fruitful.
Where, uh,
I see John. Yes.
where are you experiencing that sit down and shut up energy? Or is
Well,
that where you just kind of making an offhand comment?
yeah. That was a brusque way of expressing what I think is um, the response to questions like, well, shouldn't we have a resident uh, priest or somebody in residence who can help us hold the center in the way that Peg used to? And my experience of the answer to that is no, we're not, that's not what we want. And so we're not going to talk about that. I'm sorry, John, do you disagree with that? Do you have a different experience?
I was just curious where, I just didn't know what you were referring to with the kind of sit down and shut up piece. I think I understand now,
Yeah.
which brings me to
Yeah,
the
that
another.
and pardon me, that again was harsh language. It's something that is used, I think, as shorthand for a lot of the uh, reminders that come in a Zen community not to question structures, but to question yourself for your resistance to structures. You know?
Yeah. Maybe sometimes I feel here at Abamata, and this is coming from someone I've spent a lot of time in other sanghas, and there can be this way that I feel like other sanghas are kind of characterized in a way that makes it seem like the alternative to what we're doing is this other sort of like just um, rigid way of doing Zen. And like, I think that kind of false dichotomy makes it difficult for us to think about like this range of nuance that exists between our sort of caricature of like a Zen stick, a priest with a stick or something, and this, and like I have spent years living in Zen centers. I've practiced in many, and that has not been my experience of that kind of sit down and shut up. I feel like it's almost like a boogeyman we've created in our mind that actually hinders a lot of subtlety that I feel like goes unspoken
Yeah.
here. And so, as someone who often wants to offer a little something from those worlds, I feel like often when I bring that up, it's met with like, oh, well, that's uptight and it's committed to like this traditional way that we're not, and no. And it's a shame because I feel like there's just, as a place that identifies as a center for inquiry, I feel like I don't quite understand why there seems to be a whole range of questions that have a lot of foundation in practice in other communities and traditionally that are not available for inquiry.
I'd say that I agree with a lot of what you've said there. And again, my use of the sit down and shut up was not directed at other communities, but again, it was a terrible way to put it, but it was directed at our own parochialism and I think out of the way in which, out of loyalty and gratitude to our teachers, we have foreclosed some avenues of inquiry here in our Sangha. Kim, you had your hand up before?
Yes. Well, something I've come to realize more and more and really appreciate it is that in a good relationship, things don't always go well. And the real goodness of the relationship is in the ability to repair and also, to be honest, and what Flint talked about, like to avoid trauma, one aspect is to be able to talk about it. And I really appreciate your talk so much, Joel, this morning. And leading us in that direction of, we have a perfect relationship because we have problems and we have an ability to repair them. And that's really hopeful. And in my own relationships too, I've seen that it wasn't always perfect, but somehow we were able to work with things that weren't, peachy. So anyway, thank you, Joe, for doing this. You're very brave. You've been very brave today. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Kim. I feel the truth of what you're saying. I also want to point out that think of Flint enacting repair and reconciliation at the beginning of his talk, and that the way that reestablished the fact that we can trust this man.
I'm glad you pointed that out too. Yeah.
That his words were eloquent, but they were really meaningful because they were framed in that action.
In a way, like the Diamond Sutra, where the beginning is the whole talk. That was the whole talk.
Mm-hmm. So, Rosemary and then Kathy, okay?
Thank you, Joel. So I sit here, never having had, except for my little trip to Austin that weekend, never having had the experience that the Appamata Austin local community has had. So what I have experienced in these 2.5 years is just glorious. A whole, field of wonder and self-reflection and knowledge of this whole other area has been there for me. So, but what I have experienced over the 2.5 years is fewer and fewer people in person there while I'm here. And I'm, of course, the Zendo where the service happens and the community is in person together means a lot. And I have, well, when I began, it was really, I don't think the Zendo was open. So it was all online. So I was experiencing the local community online. Then, you know, it kept changing, and it clearly was, I felt the exodus of more local people. And I really missed it. And I didn't really talk about it. I thought, well, you know, people practice the way they practice, and you're being self-centered. You want it to be your way. So, but anyway, I just saying that I did feel it. About the model that Flint and Peg created, you know, my thought is, well, nobody expected the pandemic to happen. Something that, you know, that huge. And I think, you know, it's possible that reimagining that model based on all of this change, because what the change that happened is that the online community integrated into this local community. And talk about preparation, Joel, who was prepared for that? You know, I don't know how that felt to, you know, the local folks. You know, it's an adjustment. And I think those of us who are pretty regular we're like in there. So how does that feel? When you say at Appamata, thinking, well, what does that mean? What does at Appamata mean? Now, I think that Flint's talk, I actually was there on that Sunday, I felt he was addressing the local community in Austin. But maybe that idea of at Appamata is evolving.
Absolutely.
What are we really, you know, and yeah, so I just wrote some notes. Yeah, so that was, you know, and maybe that's, you know, it probably will never be the way it was and the way it looked before ever again. Maybe, who am I to say that? But everything is changing. So maybe the idea of opening up to what it means, because we have this network, and Peg had said that too when she left. She sees a network.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have a strong online presence. So how do you reimagine this original vision? Anyway, those are my thoughts. And thank you so much for opening up the discussion, Joel. It's so important and so difficult. And I agree with Kim how brave it is for you to do it and to be so honest with your own, you know, deep feelings about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. I wish I knew the answer to the very important question you asked, you know, but that's got to evolve, and it's got to evolve out of goodwill and engagement from as many people as possible.
Oh, I did have one more thought. Sorry. And that was that it's an opportunity, I think, to reach out to community, new people. And if we're talking about Appamata Austin in terms of in person, I think there's a big opportunity to for outreach and new folks. And I do know that Peg, Joan Harmon had shared that the way that she became involved was through a talk. I think, Kim, you know the place in Austin where different talks on different things are given, and Peg gave a series of introductory talks about Zen, and that's how Joan, so that's, I'm sure that exists, whatever she prepared, So anyway, that was my other thought about how do we move from what was to what can evolve, including new folks.
I believe, I'll just say, I believe that what you were referring to, that Joan was talking about, was talks that Peg gave at a place called Seton Cove.
Yes.
Which is run by order of Catholic nuns who at the time were provided the main structure for the administration of a major hospital in Austin, that has since evolved into a different sort of organization. But you're right that this chance to not proselytize but to attract is something that has been very important for Appamada in the past. Again, it depends a lot on the quality of the person going out there, and Peg and Flint had it going on, So.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay. Kathy, did I see you raise your hand?
Buttons there.
You got it.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you. I wanted to maybe, I could talk more than there's time for, but I wanted to hit three things. One is I'm very concerned with the number of people leaving the council. I did not know that was going on. And that's a real indicator for me. The two other points are, as you know, Joel, I don't know that others do, but I have, especially during this time, have been spending a lot of time with Morning Star Zen, which is run out of New Jersey, New York, with Father Robert Kennedy, who's the Jesuit priest. And he is going to be 90 at his next birthday. And that's one reason why I wanted to sit with that group a little bit more. I went to Ireland with them for a couple years and was decided I wouldn't go this year. What I see with them is there's a lot of people on Zoom. On Saturday, there could be 100 people all over the world, South America, Ireland, as we have in the UK, and wherever there isn't as much sitting unless there's a sashing going on. So you don't see people actually in a room except for the individuals. So it's more of a Zoom experience during the week. And what everybody knows, and they're not talking about, but it is that he's not going to be here, maybe in the next 10 years. And he has divided with all of these other people and then brings speakers in on Saturday. And it works, it works. And the other thing that I know about, well, the one thing about it is that has been a slow process. And that takes me to my other point, where I was in an organization where things came at us very quickly. And many of us were unexperienced with anything like that before. And we spent a lot of times on the theory of change process and incorporated into what we were doing, that process as best we could, but the change came so quickly. And as a result, the whole organization flipped back to what it was previously because they couldn't take the change. And that's what I would love to avoid with Appamata. And so how do we do that? How do we bring what we need into the present and maybe lead learn a little bit more about change process, and that there is frustration in it and time is needed. And you and Lori and Todd, I just can't imagine what that would have been like to be handed the physicalness of Appamata within a month almost, or two. And the support that you three really need. And yeah, we need more. There's so much more to discuss and to be with. And what I know to avoid trauma is to sit on my cushion and to reach acceptance. And only in that way can I give what I need to others in the room. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Thank you for bringing the topic up.
Kathy, let me ask you a question. Not to disagree in any way with your last statement that it's important to sit on the cushion, where you are being aware of the voices in your head and the urges and the grasping and aversion and other aspects that are simply part of our human life. But let me ask you, Flint says trauma comes from not being able to talk. Is sitting on your cushion enough?
Oh, no, it means that I reach the point that I'm able to reach others.
I see. Thank you. I missed that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I missed that.
Can I just add one more?
Yes, please.
Comment. Just again, something to kind of put out there as a matter of inquiry. It's been interesting to hear different Sangha members over the last couple of weeks talk about Flint's talk, and just notice, of course, how different aspects come forth for different people. And so it's just been really interesting to see what landed with who.
Pardon me for breaking in the middle of your statement. When you reach a point in what you want to say, if you could go back and talk about some of those aspects that people have called up, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a trend, and that's what I wanted to note here.
Okay.
Or a trend that I feel like I see, and one that I think is deeply connected to Appamata, like just the way we hold practice here. And one of the great gifts in the way that we hold practice, one of the reasons that I came here and stayed years ago, which is the psychological sophistication, I think, that Flint and Peg brought. The waking up, growing up, the psychological dimension as being discussed and explicitly integrated into Zen, which I think in general has become more prevalent over the years, but I think that's really a foundational orientation here. And so the trend is that the takeaway from Flint's talk, the part that comes up tends to be the trauma piece, which has a very psychological kind of center of gravity to it. And
I'm not the only one that has focused on that.
Yeah. and also kind of a feeling that like we're going to come back to the Zendo as the result of kind of working through our subjective psychological situation, which is probably true to some degree. On the other hand, what I heard Flint say, and this is what was kind of surprising when I've had these conversations, because what stood out to me was the part where he said, like, by like a spirited engagement with the forms can hold that. And I think the reason I ended up being, you know, in this Zen thing is because really central to the tradition as I have experienced it is an alternative, and it's not an either or, but there's an offering within Zen that suggests that perhaps you can start with the objective, start with the form, start with the body, start with a wholehearted bow, start by like learning how to hold a piece of incense beautifully, and that mind follows, spirit follows, like healing, the mind follows the body. And I feel like this Sangha is really, it's like we're not cognizant of the assumption that we're making collectively that this is primarily a psychological situation, that's primarily a matter of kind of working out our inner stuff so that we're again willing to do the outer stuff. When from my perspective, one of the great gifts that Zen has to offer in a culture, in a world that's otherwise really guided by our sentiment and our feelings, is this kind of outward orientation. And that's what I heard Flint saying and like really emphasizing at the end. And you know, so it's been challenging for me because it feels like, and maybe this is tied to what I said before, that when I kind of try to suggest that, like, well, maybe instead of having more conversations about how we feel like people are feeling and how those feelings can change so they come back, we pour everything we have into like taking care of the forms and the Zendo, you know, and our posture. Not only because I think that's really what is the tradition says, you know, and offers, but because I think it works, you know. And so that's the pattern where I just note that somehow to me that very part which seemed most kind of urgent and novel and connected to his sense of like, I need to remind you of what this practice is, seemed to be more on that objective side, on the side of like just actually doing the practice. But the way we're receiving it seems to be that that's kind of de-emphasized, and we're back to a more psychological orientation, which is all well and good. That's just another, I think, axis of inquiry that I would like to see opened up. And that I think, like I said, my comment before, that feeling of the sit down and shut upness, I think I'm sensitive to that, because when I even try to suggest like maybe the teachings of our 1,000-year-old school that say to like take up the posture as the place to start, maybe there's something there, is often met with the feeling of like that all that could be is some sort of prescriptive, rigid, religious thing. And it makes me sad because I know it's not, or it doesn't have to be. So yeah, for what it's worth, that's something I've been thinking about.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And I think, you know, as I said, I want us to listen to part of Flint's talk today, where he's talking about this about Zazen, and he talks about this tuning fork quality and the way in which, by holding our posture, walking with dignity, speaking with energy in the chants and the forms and those things, that we shape the forms shape us in, he says, in profound and often unseen ways. And that for him, as he said in his talk, that is the key to rebuilding the Sangha. And so I think your point is very clear. On the other hand, in discussing this with him, he said it's also necessary to talk out certain things, that are important for people, particularly if they feel like they've been bottling it up, So there's definitely, part of the attraction to me for Appamada has always been the openness to psychological exploration and the incredibly rich vocabulary for recognizing feelings and recognizing resonances with other people that come out of that psychological talk. But then, as you say, then there's also the forms, and there's a way in which I think, I keep pointing to this thing that Flint did at the beginning of his talk, making embodying a statement of repair and reconciliation, that's a close analog to what I think you're describing in focusing on the forms and holding those and focusing on the tradition, that those are embodiments that allow us to trust each other more, that allow us to trust the tradition more, and that open us to new possibilities beyond just like thinking about what questions we want to solve for ourselves. So I think you're completely right about that, and that is a huge part and the key part of what Flint was saying we need to focus on in the future.
And
So
it
I'm
was
sorry if
so
I seem to de-emphasize that in my talk.
And I feel too like what's hard, maybe sort of difficult to notice, is that we didn't talk about that dimension so much in the good old days, or whatever we want to call it, when Flint and Peg were here, say 8 years ago, because it was so solid. It was just there. It was in the background. The ground was there, and when the ground is solid, you don't need to talk about it. And so the conversation piece would be more the psychological piece. But now, since the ground has kind of shaken, I think these conversations explicitly, again, about the forms and about some of these things is important. So I appreciate you bringing that.
Yeah, and what you're saying is definitely directly in line with what Flint was talking to or pointing to. Thank you.
Yeah, this is just a real quick. I was really struck by what Kathy said. The word really jumped out at me, needs. And I'm sure everybody is doing this, but it seems really crucial right now to get very simple and clear, and which I think you sort of did, Joel. This is what I'm needing. Like, I'm needing help with X, Y, and Z. I mean, I think one thing that the Sangha is needing help with is the fact that, as Rosemary said, Appamada may no longer be Austin. It's now kind of worldwide, possibly. But anyway, again, so sort of a simple thought. But when Kathy used that word needs, it just jumped out at me, because it seems like what we're talking about is people having different needs. Like John's got a need for the forms, and again, just being clear about what those are, and then being able to respond compassionately to the different sets of needs that are presenting themselves, which is going to be a massive task, because it's not an either or, it's a both. That. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
I don't have anything to say directly about Appamada itself, except, Appamada was my birthplace, the birth of my practice. And then I came up to Madison And so we have been a community who has never had a resident teacher. We kind of grew up as orphans that were sort of adopted. And what I wanted to comment on is that even though we haven't had our resident teacher leave, we have still been experiencing similar kinds of trauma and difficulty in our community that are somewhat similar. So what I'm saying is part of what you're going through, and I know you know this, is kind of separate from the trauma of the teachers leaving. And just by coincidence, because what we would do is a whole lot of talking amongst ourselves. And as I have stood back and watched, I have kind of seen, not that you shouldn't talk, but my observation is sometimes the ineffectiveness of it. I mean, it's helpful, but it doesn't really, things just kind of go around in a circle sometimes. And I don't mean to be disrespectful about it. It's sort of the nature of democracy, kind of how it works. But for some reason, our new head students that just came into place decided to focus on forms, which has never been done before with us. And we are even less formal, way less formal than you, because we've had way less guidance. We look to you. And it interests me, it looks like that may be the way that we too may be able to find some means of resolving the kinds of trauma that we have. So I'm struck by the parallels, you know, even though we're slightly different. I appreciate John's comments. And the last thing I wanted to say was the observation about Flint's opening acknowledgement to Cassie, and that it is in fact the enactment of what you spoke, but it also is a representation and the enactment of our frailty, that we do this, we do these things, we do this without attribution, either we forget or, and that also is present in all of this so strongly, that this is what we are, this is what we live with, this is what we are all trying to work with all the time. I speak for myself, I speak for my community, our community within your community, among your community. And I want to thank you so much for this surprising conversation, because I really had no idea what it would turn out to be. And I'm finding that it will be very useful for me to bring back 2 hours to open door as well. So thank you all.
Thank you. And Kim, for one last comment, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah. Well, I agree with Rosemary, where she indicated that Appamada is a hybrid community now. And I was surprised in Flint's talk, where he said this talk is addressed toward, it seemed like he said it something like toward the Appamada community or to the Zendo or something like that. But I think that's something we need to come to terms with and define. What is Appamada now? Is it something that's in Austin with people on the side in other countries, or is it an international community? And then just what I've noticed in universities where I spent all my life was when a teacher would leave and a new teacher would come, the students most connected with that teacher often would leave also. And there would be a big shift in that way. It wasn't just like one person leaving. And so now it seems we do have a different community than we had 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And some people are uncomfortable with the newness of it. So anyway, but it seems a decision we need to make. What is Appamada now?
Thank you, Kim. Okay, so it's 10:47 in Austin. We have about 13 minutes, so I suggest another informal break. Get up and stretch. I'm Feeling pretty wired up. I need to go for a walk for a minute or something. I don't know what, but thank you. And I will say just quickly, here I am. I'm wearing this rakusu, which literally was stitched together by perhaps a dozen members of the Sangha, maybe more. I'm literally clothed in the care and concern and love of members of the Sangha. I feel that.